about that. So first of all, what is anticipatory grief? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is grieving that occurs prior to an actual loss. And when we have somebody who has any type of dementia, and we have started to educate ourselves about that, and one of the things that we find out is that all dementias are terminal. So anticipatory grief, as it relates to somebody with dementia, we're talking about grieving the living. Because typically when somebody hears that word grief, we automatically think death. We automatically just go to there's been a death. Grief is loss. We grieve a divorce. We grieve the loss of a job. We actually all right now are living in a state of grief because we are grieving our loss of normal. What was our normal? And so we are walking around right now in a state of grief because we're grieving what was and we don't know what's coming. But whenever we have somebody who has dementia, we are in a state of anticipatory grief. So it also is a set of cognitive, cultural, and social reactions to an expected death, and we're going to deep dive into each of these a little bit more. It's a way that we start to let go and we start to have closure before the actual death occurs. It gives us time to start to absorb the loss gradually, and we begin to prepare for the inevitable. And then it's very common in those that are facing the eventual death of a loved one, like we all are whenever we have somebody who has dementia, or it is also something that happens to someone who's terminal themselves. And we're not going to go into that as much today. I actually have this program as an hour program. I was supposed to do it at the Grief and Loss Symposium this spring, but we had to cancel that, unfortunately. But people who are terminal themselves go through anticipatory grief and go through a life review and several different things. But we're going to focus more on as being a family member. So why don't we talk about this? Why don't we talk about the grieving that we're doing? Most people are more familiar with conventional grief, which is the grief that we have after somebody passes away. So if we were to use that term, I'm really grieving the loss of my mom. I'm grieving that they're still alive. Most people don't get that. But they're still alive. You still have them. Well, yeah, they're still here, but they're gone. They're leaving. I'm watching them leave a little bit at a time as they turn the corners of this disease. We lose some of them and we watch that happen. And so people who haven't gone through the loss of somebody with dementia many times don't understand, and so we don't talk about it. People, we tend to be hesitant to express the deep pain that we're feeling before the death that we can actually call grief, and we need to call it that. We need to call it what it is. There's a gentleman who's an expert in grief. His name is David Kessler. And I was listening to a podcast of his yesterday that Jamie had told me about. And that's one of his things he really preaches. And in counseling, that's one of those things that I say all the time. When you can name that feeling, then you can own it and you can control it more. So we have to call it what it is. And I know right now we've got a lot of people that are mad. We're angry because we don't understand what's happening. But if we get right down to it, we're afraid, because we don't know what's happening. Same thing when our loved one has dementia. We're scared. We're living in that constant state of fear. What's going to happen next? And so that is part of grief. So because we don't talk about it, most of the time we don't receive the support that we need. So then I want to talk about how does it differ from conventional grief? And conventional grief, again, is whenever there's been a death, there's been a loss. Anticipatory grief is when we're going to have a loss and we know that it's coming. Anticipatory grief tends to have more anger involved with it because we have this period of time where we can be mad, and that's okay to be mad. It has a more loss of emotional control, and then it does tend to also have more atypical grief responses. And that's called complicated grief. Complicated grief is when we, let me first say there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And everybody's grief is very, very different. What my grief's going to look like and your grief's going to look like, it's different within a family. When one person loses a parent and there's 4 kids, all 4 kids are going to grieve in different ways, and that's all okay. But there's also something called complicated grief. And most of the time it's these things I've listed here. It's basically when a person starts to shut down. It's an intense sorrow. They become numb. They may not want to get out of the bed. They are completely bitter, mad at the world, not trusting anyone. But we can see that in ourselves as we're going through this anticipatory grief. One of the hardest things about anticipatory grief with our loved one who has dementia is this bullet point, this 4th bullet point. We have this balancing act where we're still holding on to them because they're here, and we're wanting to make the most of every day, and we're wanting to make the most of our time with them. But on the other hand, we're having to let go of them a little bit at a time. So we are trying to juggle those emotions of holding on and letting go at the same time. And that's very difficult to do. And it's very difficult to make other people understand that. Well, I found this yesterday. 40% of women in a study said that the anticipatory grief was worse or harder on them than the post-loss grief was, that they actually had a harder time with the anticipatory grief than they did the conventional grief after their loved one had died. I thought that was interesting. So there are a lot of symptoms to anticipatory grief that I want us to go through. I'm sure you're going to see some of these in yourself. And just again, I want to stress that all of these things are very normal to be feeling. But again, it's calling it what it is, being able to call it what it is so that you can own that. So grief refers to the reactions that we experience when loss upsets the usual routine of our life, any type of a loss. And again, this can be a loss from a marriage, a job, a pet, retirement actually can bring this kind of grief, or what we're going through right now with our loss of normalcy. And they are physical, behavioral, psychological, which means it's going to affect us in our cognitive and emotional states, social and spiritual. So let's look at some of them specifically, what anticipatory grief can look like. It can just be sadness and tearfulness, where it just comes over us rapidly and unexpectedly. But what this is doing is it's allowing grief to help us prepare for our loss. We may find ourselves crying at commercials of the daddy dancing with the daughter because it's our dad who has dementia. We may find ourselves crying at the Hallmark movies. We may find ourselves crying at a restaurant because something reminds us of our loved one. This is all normal grief. Because I've had people say, Holly, I don't know what's happening to me. I cry at the drop of a hat. It's okay. This is why. That's why we're doing this program, so that you understand this is okay to be feeling this. Another thing you may be having is fear, anger, and irritability. And the more you educate yourself, the more you do classes like this, the more you read, the more you get in support groups, will help with fear, anger, and irritability, where you see, okay, other people are going through this too, and they're afraid as well. Because this is not a disease. None of the dementias, these are not diseases where we have that checkbox and go, okay, they've done that. Okay, what's next? They've done that. We don't know. It's day to day, it's hour to hour, it's minute to minute. Loneliness and depression is a symptom of anticipatory grief because, like I said earlier, we don't talk about it. Our loved one is still alive, but we don't have the same relationship with them. And so we can be very, very lonely living in a house with somebody because they aren't there like they used to be. So we don't talk about it because we fear others won't understand because our loved one is still alive. If you don't talk to someone and be proactive, this can lead to social withdrawal and emotional numbness that you'll do to yourself to protect yourself from that pain. And then resentment. is another part of anticipatory grief, which can lead to guilt. And we're actually going to talk about a couple of different kinds of guilt that go along with anticipatory grief. And this is where I'm going to encourage you to enlist help, to ask for help, but to also continue to live your life, to be taking care of yourself. So some more symptoms of anticipatory grief is anxiety. Whenever we are taking care of somebody who's dying, we're living in a heightened state of awareness all the time. I have caregivers tell me all the time, I understand this completely. I sleep with one eye open and one ear open because I never get to completely rest. I'm always on edge. We will develop a really high startle reflex because we're listening for what's happening next, what's going to happen next. That can start to cause physical symptoms. We can start to have palpitations. We can even develop a tremble where our hands will shake. Here's guilt again. Now this one's very difficult, and this is another one of those things that we don't talk about a lot, where we may actually be praying or wishing or hoping that they would go ahead and pass so that their suffering and pain be over and that our suffering and pain be over. That's really hard. That's a talk I've had with a lot of families in my office where they go, Holly, I just feel so guilty because I'm just praying it be over. Is that wrong? So again, if you're having those thoughts or those feelings, and most of us do, please know most people are having those same thoughts. There's also something called survivor's guilt. And this is the guilt that you get whenever you feel guilty because you're still able to go on with your life and they can't. I hear this a lot in spouses. We were supposed to travel. How can I travel when they can't? How can I possibly go on living when they can't? So that is called survivor's guilt. Another thing we might do is we might actually go through the rehearsal of the death. And it's where we visualize what our life's going to be like when they're gone. And I put this in bold. You may feel guilty about this, but it is very normal and a part of accepting the inevitability of death. This is just part of accepting it, is where we go ahead and let our minds go to, what will my life be like afterwards? We can start to develop physical problems, like I mentioned earlier, with the palpitations or the shakes or the tremors, sleep difficulty. We ourselves can start to develop memory problems. That is not dementia because it is not contagious. We get asked that question all the time. That's stress that's making you have memory problems, and where you may be walking in the room and going, why did I come in here? Or where are my keys? And they're in your, where are my glasses? And they're on your head. That's stress. You've got a lot of things on your mind. Muscle aches and pains, starting to have physical problems. I know that a lot of you have shared in some of the support groups we do about catching yourself starting to be bent over, starting to pull in, your body reacts to this stress. And then the fear of the loss, and that's fears about what the future will hold and who's going to take care of you. Because if this was your spouse, you were supposed to take care of each other. And now am I going to be a burden on my kids? When it's an adult child who's taking care of a parent, those fears can be, am I spending so much time taking care of my parents, I'm neglecting my spouse, or I'm neglecting my kids or my grandkids. So there are some benefits of anticipatory grief. Rather than just looking at all of the doom and gloom of it, there actually are some benefits of it. And this is where we just kind of change our thinking on this. It gives us time to have some important conversations. If our loved one gets diagnosed early enough, we recognize what's happening. If we haven't already had those important talks about advanced directives and final plans and their wishes, then we get to have the time to do that with them so that we're not just having to make decisions based on what we think they would want. And I'm telling you, having sat with, I was saying over 200 people, I'm thinking I may be getting closer to 250 now, as they've passed away, and be able to sit with families and have them say to me, I know this is what they would have wanted. I know I have things in place because we talked about it. Having time gives you the chance to do that. It also gives us time for forgiveness. Many times we've got some unfinished issues or unfinished business, and I actually have a whole slide on that we'll talk about more in a minute. It also can give us quality time, though, so that we make the very best of the time that we do have left. It gives us time to start to let go of some of that guilt and anger that we are going to be feeling, where we get to the point. Yesterday, we had a fantastic support group, those of you that were on it, and we actually talked a lot about what matters at the end of the day. And somebody was saying, you know, her husband had come out and he had on 2 pairs of pants, 2 shirts, and he had it. And she went, but he was dressed. So I wasn't going to say anything. He had clothes on. He can still dress himself. Finding those good things in it. It also gives us time to make plans for the future. And it gives us time to leave a legacy or to create moments that family and friends can enjoy. One of the best things that I have seen families do while they have time to do it is, especially now that we have these cell phones where we can record, is they get their loved one to tell their stories. Tell me the story of. I went with my granddad and I made a Grandfather Remembers book, and I wrote the stories, because that was before the phones. I wrote the stories of he and his brother used to ride a horse to school in Western Oklahoma, and he told me those stories. And so I have all of those stories that I can then share with the family. So it gives you time to do that. So here's this slide on unfinished business. So unfinished business is not only writing a will and other matters of an estate, but also being able to express appreciations and disappointments and saying what needs to be said before they die. Sometimes the person that we're taking care of may not have had the best relationship with them. This happens a lot with adult children who are having to take care of a parent that maybe they weren't the best parent. And here we are at this point, and we're having to take care of somebody that we still really have some issues with. Now, depending on when the diagnosis is made, sometimes we can settle some issues that we may have had, and sometimes we can't. And that actually is another type of loss called ambiguous grief, which we're going to do an entire program on later this year. Ambiguous grief is something that happens with our loved ones that have dementia, but it's where we can't get closure because we don't understand. Ambiguous grief is where we are, those of you who have seen Still Magnolias, when Sally Field's out in the cemetery and she's just screaming at God, I don't understand. Why couldn't it have been me? Why did it have to be her? We may have done that about dementia. How could this possibly happen to my brilliant mom, dad, husband, wife, friend? They didn't do anything to make this happen. That's called ambiguous grief, where we can't get that closure because we can't wrap our mind around it. So it's very beneficial to everyone concerned to make peace with the person who is passing so that you don't have that unfinished business before they pass. Otherwise, the survivors will deal with regrets once the loved one has passed. And families often need encouragement and permission to do this. And that's where somebody like me comes in, or a social worker comes in, or people in a support group who've gone through this before comes in, where you give yourself permission to go ahead and make some peace with those things in the past, even if you're never going to hear from your loved one, I'm sorry that happened. Because maybe they've lost the ability to be able to do that, but you need to be able to make that peace. So I did want to just briefly mention about anticipatory grief in the patient, because even in somebody who has dementia, we will see this happen. People who are dying experience anticipatory grief. They are working through a type of separation anxiety. We, on this side of the disease, are losing one person. They're losing everybody. If you think about that a minute. They're not just losing one person. They're losing every single relationship they ever had. And for a while, they know that. They realize it. Earlier in the disease, they know something's wrong. They're losing all of their relationships at the same time rather than just one, like we, the survivors, are going through. It can be overwhelming, and many times, and I used that word patient because not everybody is here, the person with dementia will withdraw, they'll face the wall, and it's a way that they're trying to cope with the impact of their loss, especially further into the disease, as we start to see people who may withdraw and start to kind of maybe have that flat affect and stare off and they're facing a wall. Sometimes that is just them. It's almost like that cocoon of self-protection. Okay, 3 ways which we can cope with anticipatory grief. And here's the first one. Attempting to understand and assess what is happening, or trying to reframe the situation, viewing the glass as half full rather than half empty. The focus is on what one still has and what can be done with the time available. This is one of the very best things that we can do. Rather than sitting around, or when somebody calls and asks about our loved one, instead of starting with, well, now they can't, and they used to be able, and they can't. What can they do? You know, we really still enjoy music together. And music's one of those things that stays. So if you're not using music with your loved one, please do that. Their music. You know, they're not verbal much anymore, but boy, they can sure pat my hand as we're listening to music. And that's some of our best times. We can say prayers together and not focus on, well, you know, they can't feed themselves anymore. You know what? They're still eating and they still love their ice cream. So rather than they can't do this, they can do this, and we still enjoy, and they still have quality of life, and this is what it looks like. So that's reframing, and it's also a lot of positive self-talk. Second thing we can do, trying to do something about the loss, trying non-traditional methods of medicine, seeking the opinion of another physician, or looking for outside assistance. And many times this is what families will do earlier in the disease. I know in our own case, we went and got several different, we went to many different doctors because we weren't going to take it from the first doctor. They didn't know what they were talking about. The second doctor didn't know what they were talking about. The third doctor didn't. Finally, the fourth doctor, we decided maybe they know what they're talking about since they're all giving us the same answer. But that's one of those things that we can do so that we can say, there are some people that need to be able to say, I know I did everything. We tried everything. And then the third thing, and this is just huge, trying to control one's own reactions to the situations, looking for meaning, and turning to sources of religious or spiritual consolation. Making efforts to heal estrangements, leaving legacies, settling estates, planning the funeral, doing a life review, and saying goodbye. Now, I want to focus on that word meaning, because this is part of that podcast that I just listened to, and I know there's a reason that I just listened to it before doing this. This is not finding meaning in the loss. That's not what it's talking about at all. It's finding meaning in the relationship. And this gentleman, David Kessler, who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has actually added meaning as one of those stages of grief that we go through, that we don't just get to acceptance and go, well, I've dealt with my father's death. Because we've never, it never closes, it's never over. But if we can get to the point that we find meaning, not in the death, we're never going to find a meaning in the death, but to be able to focus on and find a meaning in the relationship. And the example he gave, and unfortunately, this poor man actually lost a child. He lost a child who was 21 years old. And he said, I will never find meaning in his death, but where I find meaning is in those 21 years that I got to be his dad. So I think for each of us to think about that, that person got to be my mom. I got to have the experience of them raising me. I got 55 years with this man as my husband. That's the meaning. That's the focus that we're talking about when we use that word meaning. Focusing on, they were my brother, they were my sister. What a privilege it was for that person to be my friend for 25 years, whatever it was. And again, this is part of that reframing and how we look at this loss. I did want to put some things on here about the reality of dementia. Our loved one is gone, but they're still here. We have to take care of both them, but as we're taking care of ourselves. So we play that dual role of I'm a caregiver, but I also have my own needs. I wish it was over, but I wish they'd keep living. And I've pulled every one of these from things that have been said right in my office and things that have come out of my own mouth. These are just feelings that we have that are real. I'm both sad about my lost hopes and dreams, but I'm happy about some new hopes and dreams. And we're feeling all of this at the same time. Wow, good timing, because I've got 11:29. So that is just kind of dipping our toe into what is anticipatory grief.
That was an awesome class, awesome.
Oh, thank you. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see who all I'm talking to again. Did anybody have any questions? And this is one of those that and this can go pretty deep. You may start thinking about it later and go, wow, I got a question about that. On this slide, oh, I chose a slide that just had Jamie's information on it. So you can email Jamie. Jamie will email these slides out. My email is exactly like Jamie's, but it's hglover, Glover. You can see my name on the screen there, at jameslwest.org. Or you can call us. Most of you probably already have both of our emails. If you think of something else, or if you've just got a question about it. But does anybody have anything right now? Thanks, Wilson, for saying that.
It was a great program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of good information.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In the chat room, how can I help my spouse process anticipatory grief?
I think it's helpful to know that this is a grief process. Sometimes you get busy with life and taking care of yourself and them and life, and you forget that we're grieving. And I think that's a helpful comment about that we just need to take time and realize maybe some of those symptoms we're grieving.
Absolutely. And to call it that, like you said,
to call it that.
To call it grief. When you're asking about helping your spouse process anticipatory grief, what's the relationship? Is the spouse the person with dementia, or is the spouse the, yes. So most of the time, allowing somebody to go through and do a life review, talking them through a life review, and a life review is really going back and talking about, almost like doing an autobiography, where we go back and we talk about our life and go ahead and let somebody talk about their regrets. We all have them. And to own, because nobody's going to be able to go, I had the most perfect, beautiful, wonderful life. Nothing ever went wrong. Yeah, it did. And to allow them to own those things as well. Trying to do some legacy work is a good thing to do as well. And that's where you are recording those stories, letting them write it, you write it, those type things. And then my main thing, I think, with allowing them to process anticipatory grief is not trying to fix it. Because when somebody is sharing their story with us, we want to try to fix. There's nothing to fix. Let them feel what they're feeling, be there with them, hold their hand, put your arm around them, and just let them say what they need to say. It might not be what you want to hear, but it might be what they need to say. If we want to go deeper into working through anticipatory grief, do you have direction or suggestions? Absolutely. If you go to, there's a lot out there on anticipatory grief right now where you can just Google anticipatory grief. You'll find articles, there's books on it, there's workbooks on it. It's kind of one of those, like mindfulness is a term right now, and I think we're going to be hearing more and more about it. If you do something like anticipatory grief dementia, that will really get you some specific information.
I thought that little fact that, you know, you're losing that person, but they're losing everyone. That really just, you know, struck with me when you said it.
Yeah. Because we get caught up in our feelings and how this is affecting us.
Yeah.
And sometimes we stop to forget that we're losing one person and we're losing one relationship. They're losing every relationship. It's a lot to think about. And I hope that this will stay with you and that you'll continue to think about it today. And as you get these slides, one question I lost another one on 1985 early on. Could it be due to combined role being absolutely? Yes, it's going to be different every time you do it. We have so many folks, you know, that'll say, well, I took care of my mother, but now it's my wife, or I took care of my grandparent, but now it's my parent. It's going to be different every time. Your grief's going to be different because your relationship to that person was different. How you felt about them, the emotions that you have tied to them are going to be very different. So yeah, and thank you for saying, you know, telling you I felt all of these, but it's good to know I'm not going crazy. That's why I wanted to keep saying on there, this is all normal. It is okay for you to be feeling this, and it's okay for you to tell people you're feeling this and that it is grief. That's exactly what it is. And if they don't understand that grief, because I've had people say that to me before, but she's still alive. Well, yeah, she's still alive. But she's sure not who she was 5 years ago or 6 months ago or last week, because I'm losing her a little bit at a time. And that's where we get to educate people. I'll tell you, we have a lot of people who come onto our programs and our support groups whose loved ones have already passed away, but they keep coming back because now they find themselves educating other people all the time. It's just amazing where this journey will take you, this journey you never wanted to be on, the skill set that you never wanted. None of us wanted to know how to do this. It'll take you places and it'll put you in front of people that you never would have thought.
I find people that they'll wonder, and I'll invite them to these classes and say, here's some answers. There's the answers right here.
Mm-hmm.
You can find them. And they still, you know, it's like dragging a mule out of a barn.
Yeah.
You know?
It takes some time, but I always encourage families to continue to invite people, send them information, and then you've done your part, and what they do with it, they do with it. But I'll tell you, I've had an awful lot of folks come back later and go, you know, my sister-in-law sent me some brochures and I found y'all sticker on the back of it and I wasn't going to read them, but then I did one morning at 2 in the morning, and they get in touch with us, and it might be months later, but you know, you put it out there. How can I get a copy of the recording? Jamie, where will it be on our website? The recording?
I will email it to you. I'll email the link to everybody.
She'll email the recording.
Yes.
So we'll email you the recording. All right, thanks everybody. If you think of anything else, please reach out to us. Jamie will be sending you the recording and the slides that go with this. Be looking for that one that we're going to do. We actually sat yesterday and came up with more of these bite-sized sessions all the way through the fall. And one of them will be the one on ambiguous grief. So be looking for that, plus a lot of other ones. And if you have ideas of programs you'd like to see, please shoot us an email, call us, let us know. We will put one together, because that's where we got the idea to do these, was from programs just like this and support groups where people have gone, hey, will you talk about? In fact, next week we're doing one called But I Made a Promise.
Mm-hmm.
And that came from a suggestion from somebody, because so many of us can say that, but I made a promise I'd never place them.
Mm-hmm.
I promised to keep it. So we're going to talk about that next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you.
A lot of information.
Thank you, Wilson. See y'all later.